Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, good morning and welcome to our intergenerational dialogue of continents on climate-induced migration in the framework of adaptation, jointly organized by Youth and Environment Europe, the International Foundation for African Children, and the European Environmental Bureau. My name is Tima Aboisa. I am Climate Crisis Liaison Officer at YE, and together with my colleague Adela Pokorna, who is YE's COP delegate on adaptation and climate-induced migration, we will be our host for this event. I have the honor to guide you through the first part of our event and introduce the keynote speakers. And Adela will facilitate the intergenerational panel dialogue and discussion with the audience. Let me briefly introduce our hosting organizations. Youth and Environment Europe is the largest independent European network of environmental youth organizations. It unites 42 member organizations coming from 25 countries with the aim of enabling and empowering young people from Europe to participate in decision-making related to environmental issues. The International Foundation for African Children is the largest NGO network in Africa dedicated to the cause of African children and youth in enhancing their social economic development through plethora and pragmatic programs anchored on sustainable development options and strategies. The European Environmental Bureau is Europe's largest network of environmental citizens organizations. EEB brings together 180 member organizations from 38 countries. EEB stands for Sustainable Development, Environmental Justice, and Participatory Democracy. The purpose of this event is to foster a dialogue between European, African, and Latin American youth with decision makers on the challenges of climate-induced migration, with stress of regional disparities and environmental injustice related to climate change and migration, as well as on possible solutions to these issues. During the panel discussion, the youth representatives will share their position on these topics and request the feedback of decision makers. After the panel discussion, the audience will have the opportunity to ask their questions as well, and we will close our event with a reception. Another aim of this event is the handover of the Climate of Change petition. I would like to invite a representative of EEB, Fanny Quish, to briefly introduce the Climate of Change campaign. Fanny, the floor is yours.
My name is Fanny Kish. I am the Hungarian ambassador for the Climate of Change project, co-funded by the European Commission in the framework of the DEAR program. Our main goal is to build a better future, both for climate-induced migrants, who are really the human faces of climate change, and for young people who will face the worst effects of climate change. The young people who feel sad, anxious, angry, powerless, helpless, and afraid. We are afraid when we see the ocean's roars of anger swallowing cities and villages. We are afraid when we see the seas vomiting to the beach, dead fish and animals. We are afraid that in a few years, humans will be known as the species that extinguished itself. We are afraid because we are young, and we have many more years left on this earth. Yet our earth is on fire. By 2050, no child will be safe. And that is what we want to change, and our petition is a great first step. Walt Disney has taught children that dreams come true. Well, we dream of a healthy environment. We dream of a sustainable world. Uncertainty. Sadly, that is the perfect word to describe our future. As the impacts of climate change intensify over time, one thing has become certain. We will leave the earth to today's children and to young people and to future generations. The world is home to 1.8 billion young people between the ages of 10 to 24, which is the largest generation of youth in history. And we have a voice. Not only do we have a voice, we will have our voices heard. Young people are increasingly aware of the challenges and the risks presented by the climate crisis. It is our generation that must make policymakers accountable to make sure that we do not betray the future of humankind. Today, I stand here with 4 young other ambassadors, Penny from Greece, Emma from Bulgaria, Camilla from Poland, and Paloma from Spain. But I do not only speak on behalf of them. I speak on behalf of more than 100,000 people who have signed our petition, 100,000 people who care about climate change and who want to be part of a climate of change. More than 100,000 people who understand that today is the time to solve this, or else there will be no tomorrow. So, what are we demanding in our petition? 4 points, 4 crucial steps. First, we are asking the EU to accelerate its ambitions of climate neutrality, not by 2050, but by 2040, to ensure that global warming remains below 1.5 degrees, to avoid catastrophic levels. We are asking the EU to decarbonize its economy by speeding up the transition to clean, renewable energy technologies. Next, we are asking to shift towards a socially and ecologically just well-being economy, and finally putting the interests of us, people, on top of the interests of corporations. Instead of constantly aiming for economic and productivity growth, the economy must be regenerative, sustainable, democratic, fair, and caring. We have to finally see what is more important. Third, we are asking to boost local resilience and global justice by providing financial and technical support to countries that are affected by climate change, even though they are not the most responsible. When I was a little girl in school, I was always angry with collective punishment, always mad when I was punished for something I did not do. So I understand why these countries are mad. I understand why they are crying for help, because they are suffering because of something they did not do. And fourth, the youth. Young people are important but underrepresented stakeholders with a stake in the present and even more in the future. Policymakers must enable youth participation and integrate our views and vision into political decision. They have to listen to us, because if not us, then who? And if not now, when? We will go on until we see some change. We will not stop at just 105,311 people. We will not allow anyone to get away with this. Europe, we are asking for more from you. You cannot keep covering your ears to Mother Nature's screams and closing your eyes to all her help-wanted signs. You cannot keep having what we are saying come in one ear and out the other. We ask for no more excuses. Our petition asks for a change. Turn words into action, because together we can start a climate of change and demand climate justice for all. And at the end of the side event, we will hand over the petition, so please join us for a picture. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Fanny, for sharing this initiative. Indeed, the adverse effects of climate change are forcing more and more people to leave their homes and even their countries. For setting the scene of today's discussion, I would like to invite our first keynote speaker, Ms. Cinziana Puskás, Climate Change and Migration Specialist of the International Organization of Migration, to introduce the recent trends and future projections on climate-induced migration. Let's welcome her with a big applause.
Thank you so much for inviting the International Organization for Migration to be here with you today, and I'm very honored that I'm here on this panel with such distinguished experts and policymakers and youth leaders. And really congratulations for choosing this topic and for really showing the significance of it here at COP27. was just talking to our organizers before. It's the first time for IOM, at least, since many years that we see so much focus on climate migration at COPs. We remember 2007 when we did the first and only side event at COP on climate migration, and now I think we have counted over 50 side events focusing on this. So really fantastic that we are all joining on this importance. And just building on what our previous speaker said, that there are 1.8 billion youth in the world. I want to see how many of them are here in the room today. Who's the youth in the room, if we can? Woo! Okay, good. So we are at COP as well. I don't know if I can still be youth, but I'll pretend for today at least. We know that we are 1.8 billion youth in the world, and we are facing the climate crisis, and we are one of the main stakeholders in this. If climate change is not resolved for people now, it has to be for us at least. Going a bit more into the migration side, we know that climate migration is already a reality. We know that human mobility is, in the context of climate change, is already a reality. The links between migration and the environment are not something new. We have seen this throughout history. What is new now is what I was explaining before as well, is the political momentum of it, and also the increased and intensifying adverse effects of climate change. We have seen the data and the science emphasize that we are at a crucial moment now with the worst effects of climate change happening and getting even worse in the years to come. They are impacting people's lives and livelihoods and the well-being of the entire planet. There is a growing awareness. There's a lot of body of data and science coming from a lot of different parts of the society, data experts, but also international organizations, academia, university, civil society, and this is growing. But if we look at these estimates, they are quite daunting, they are quite alarming, they are quite heavy. Disasters alone, so disasters only, displaced 23 million people in 2021. These are only disasters, right? We don't know exactly what happens in slow onset contexts, for example. And we know that among these 23 million people, there are youth too. The problem is we don't have enough data on this. There's the International Displacement Monitoring Center published a report looking specifically at the youth data, and this was one of their conclusions, that their youth and children are actually invisible in data. We do not know how they are represented. What we know, what we have managed to get, the little data we have, is that there are nearly 10 million children displaced in the context of weather-related shocks. So very specific data. With around 1 billion children, nearly half of the world's 2 billion children living in 33 countries at high risk of impact of climate change, million more children could actually be on the move in the coming years. And I was mentioning slow onset events because this is something that we have heard a lot here at COP as well, also in the negotiations, but also as a focus that it's perhaps not that evident in the trends and data. And we know that land degradation, sea level rise, desertification have huge impacts on human mobility. It's not always direct, there's not necessarily a causality all the time, but people's decisions to move are always influenced by this kind of drivers, because they impact people's lives, they impact people's livelihoods, they impact the way that they run their communities. I remember one example that the ambassador of Fiji in Geneva gave. She was explaining the context of Fiji. If people that were fishermen and live on the coast have now to move internally and become herders, what does that mean for their life? What does that mean for their future? How can they actually adapt to that? We don't know much about these impacts, but we do know that millions of people are affected by it. We know that agriculture productivity linked to drought in Central America are combining with the socio-economic effects of the pandemic and the frequent environmental hazards, and they lead to record movements in the Darien Gap and the US-Mexico border in 2021. We have seen the fourth consecutive year of drought in the Horn of Africa, which has endangered livestock, livelihoods, and has left an estimated 15 million people severely affected in Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia, and has pushed thousands of families to leave their homes to look for food, for water, for pastures, and most of them going to urban areas. We also know that the climate shocks interact with conflict, interact with chronic vulnerabilities, including weak governance and endemic poverty. And we have seen this has put millions at risk in the Sahel region, with over 30 million people estimated that require our assistance in 2022. As we look to the future, the scenarios, I'm afraid, are not very good. I don't have very good news for you today. The increase of storms, drought, sea level rise is what the IPCC has predicted. And the IPCC has also said very clearly that if this happens, then more people will be on the move. A very important report we have seen from the World Bank, the Groundswell report, has projected that some 216 million people could become internal climate migrants by 2050 if we do not take any climate action. If we look at this number in comparison with the demographic of children and youth that we were talking about at the beginning, it is very likely that children and youth will be part of this increasing number of internal climate migrants. And we have seen that the IPCC in its report this year has very clearly said this, that regions with more youthful populations are both highly vulnerable to climate change impacts and are reliant on agriculture, forestry, aquaculture, fisheries for their livelihoods. And in these regions, we expect youth out-migration to urban areas to be a trend. The only good news I have for today is that if we do take climate action now, if this COP will achieve what it wants to achieve, if the next COP will achieve what it wants to achieve, we have a chance to reduce these numbers. And the World Bank has told us that we can reduce the numbers that I presented to you by as much as 80%. That means going from 216 million people on the move by 2050 to 44 million people by 2050. But this means we have to take action. And we don't really have a lot of time left. A lot of colleagues at COP27 have been talking and saying that the world is on the brink. Maybe we are a bit over the brink already. We have less than 10 years to keep temperature rise well below 1.5 degrees. 10 years, that's probably not that much. We have less than 7 years to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals from the 2030 agenda. And when it comes to climate displacement, we really have no more time. This is already a reality, and we have to work with future generations to address it and to minimize it. The solutions that we see, and I will close on this, and I encourage you to read our report that we published right before COP, expressing the solutions that we see that can be taken to address the nexus between human mobility and climate change are three-pronged. So we look at solutions for people to stay in their homes, as many want that as their first option. It means working on disaster risk reduction, on climate change adaptation, on sustainable development, to ensure that people have the resilience they need, to ensure the well-being of people, to ensure life as they have it now. In the future, this also means averting and minimizing displacement in line with the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, in line with the Paris Agreement. The second solution we see is to provide people with an option on the move. Many do not have any other choice but to move. This is a question of life or death for them. And people move sometimes just for a bed for the night. They need to find shelter from disasters. In order to do this, we need to minimize the losses and damages we see from climate change. We also need to minimize, address, and avert displacement through better anticipatory action, emergency preparedness, but also emergency relief, humanitarian action. And this should all be in line with the UN Secretary Action Agenda on Internal Displacement. And finally, the third solution we see is for people that are already on the move, as some of them are compelled to be on the move. And this is where we look at pathways for migration. This is where we look at ways that people can travel in safe and regular ways. And this is where states have put very strong commitments in the Global Compact for migration and the Global Compact on refugees on how to do this. We have quite a daunting scenario ahead of us. We have very, very limited time, but we know what we have to do, and I think all of us in this room know what we have to do. I think it's now very high time that we go back and we do our part, and then we put the pressure that we have to put to finish what we have started. Thank you so much for inviting us today, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'll be looking forward to the next speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cinziana, for this very informative and engaging speech. Indeed, these data showcase the urgency of this issue. And now, let me welcome our next keynote speaker, Narana Enghin, who is a student of Webster University, and she will briefly introduce us a case study from Mongolia on climate-induced migration. Welcome.
So, hello, thank you for coming, and I will be giving you a case study of Mongolia with climate-induced migration. So, nomadism in Mongolia is very important. It's part of our culture. It's been there for thousands of years. It's part of our national identity. And we've been internal migrants for, in this sense, for many, many years. Many hundreds and thousands of years. However, this migration is induced by climate change now. People are they can no longer live their nomadic ways of life, and they have to move to cities now. So if you see this figure, rates of internal migration in Mongolia, you can see that there are more people moving to urban cities and giving up their lives, and this might be this is a good correlation with maybe the impacts of climate change, but it cannot be for sure certain, since it is obviously a correlation, but we can't really be sure if it's causation. So as you can see, Ulaanbaatar is the capital city of Mongolia, and a lot of migration is towards there internally. So I will speak about challenges to nomadism in Mongolia. So these include Dzot. So Dzot is a climate crisis in Mongolia where it's warming up too fast. So the snow melts too quickly, too early in the season, and then it freezes again, creating a layer of ice, and thus starving these animals because they can't reach the pasture land because of this layer of ice. So there has been a lot of deaths, and nomads can no longer live this way of life. As you can see, they resort to bringing their animals, their herds, into their yurts, the traditional house in Mongolia. They put them there in order to save them in a last chance to save them. And as you can see, it has a lot of impacts, and it's causing a lot of nomads to, suffer. Another big issue for nomads is water scarcity. According to our research done by Sternberg, it is the most frequently cited issue between nomads. They cite that they have problems with water supply, precipitation, insects, pastureland, extreme winter weather, dust and droughts. But water supply is the one that they always cite. So the most important water issues, according to nomads, are the lack of water, broken wells, as saline water, and low levels of waters available. And the rivers and springs are drying out because of global change, global warming, and there's also mining. The mining industry in Mongolia is very important for the economy, and it is also an issue contributing to this problem. So dust interference. As we know, there's the Gobi Desert in Mongolia, and it's creating dust storms, and it increases every year. So this is also a problem. There's competition for grass with insects. And I would also like to talk about the history of Mongolia, because there was a transition from a socialist state to a democratic state, which is important in this issue. So Mongolia was a communist state, as you may know. I'm not sure. And communism shifted land possession and livestock to a powerful central state. So it meant that they had financial and logistic support. They were salaried, so they didn't have to think about business as much. And they were removed from economic and social pressures, according to many articles I've read. And because of collectivization, they were provided water infrastructures, transport, veterinary care, and emergency fodder. And the one important thing too to note is that they regulated livestock numbers here. But after democratization, there was a shift in privatization of livestock. And there was also a lack of government regulation now. They were very laissez-faire, and it was too quick. The transition was very quick, and it's more about criticism on the transition than whether democracy or communism is good. It's more about the transition that's the problem here. And there was a change in land tenure and new economic pressures for nomads, since they're not salaried anymore. So democratization in Mongolia, the democratic market economy started in 1990 with the democratic revolution in Mongolia. And there were shifts in land and livestock possessions, reduced mobility, to maximize livestock production, increased sedentarization. There was also concentration on income-producing livestock, which is very important in this debate, because with the socialist system, they had to meet quotas. But now that with democratization, with the bad transition, they have to generate their own income, and there's a very strong pressure for them to, herd animals that are the most economically sufficient. So they get these goats that you can see here, and they're very bad for the desertification. They actually eat to the roots, which causes a big part of desertification in Mongolia in pasture lands. And there's too many of these goats in Mongolia, and they cannot keep up. Because before, with nomadism, people moved around, so the land had time to regenerate. But now that it's sedentarized, it's harder. So this is just contributing. It's a cycle that's just making itself worse and worse. These nomads, they're forced to comply and adapt, but these adaptations that they're taking, it's bad for the environment and making their case even worse. So also with deterioration of infrastructures and the environment, they don't have access to water sources anymore because of bad water infrastructures, land degradation due to overgrazing, as I mentioned, because of lack of regulation and economic incentives. So 70% of Mongolian land has degraded, and while 30% of Mongolian land has severely degraded. So it's actually, it's not even, it's not very positive for Mongolia's case, especially since, you know, as you can see with this map, if you would like to take a picture and look at it in further detail, it's just a system that's making itself worse. And there's also a new regime of debt because nomads can no longer afford what the socialist state would provide them, which forces them to take loans and become indebted. And banks only make loans to pastoralists who have 75 sheep and goats to put as collaterals. So, and due to Tut that I mentioned, many have lost their lands and fell into debt. So it forced them to quit their livelihood as pastoralists and move to cities or mines. So, yeah, so my conclusion, very quickly, the process of improper democratization has led to the internal displacement and major environmental degradation, leaving many pastoralists struggling and desperate. Well, thank you for listening. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Narana, for sharing this very interesting country-specific case study of Mongolia on climate-induced migration. And now it is time to start our second session of our event. And I would like to give the floor to my colleague Adela, who will introduce our distinguished panelists.
Thank you, Tima. As Tima previously mentioned, my name is Adela Pokorna, and I'm YE's COP27 delegate on adaptation and climate-induced migration. And I have the pleasure to moderate this exciting intergenerational panel of youth and decision makers from multiple continents. It is my great pleasure to welcome them on stage. Please let me introduce the high-level representatives, our distinguished speakers for this panel. His Excellency Nuva Makaka, Minister of Natural Resources and Climate Change of the Republic of Malawi. Ms. Coco Warner, Manager of the Impacts, Vulnerability and Risk Subprogram of UNFCCC. Welcome. And unfortunately, due to her negotiation duties and last-minute changes of her agenda, we cannot welcome Ms. Florencia Mitchell, National Director of Climate Change at the Ministry of Environment of Argentina. Therefore, we don't have a high-level representative of Latin America. However, we hope that you will excuse her absence. However, as a youth speakers, we are very pleased to welcome Solomon Yellow, Campaign Director of Pacific Islands and Student Party Climate Change. So welcome. Next is Violena Silva, Youth Representative of Engajamundo. Welcome. Paloma Abreu Ponchela, Youth Representative of European Environmental Bureau. And next to her, Fanny Kish, Youth Representative of Environmental Bureau. Welcome. And on behalf of African youth and children, we have Michael Nafayeku, President and Youth Representative of International Foundation for African Children. Happy to have you here. We are excited that we have you here, distinguished guests, and we are welcoming you at our panel. Now, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to our youth speakers to present your statement and ask questions to our dear decision makers. So, Fanny, if you can please begin. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, as I've mentioned in my speech, the countries which contribute to the climate crisis the least suffer the most. And in some communities, the impacts of climate change make a livelihood and human survival impossible. Therefore, these people are losing their homes because of environmental degradation and climate-induced catastrophes. So my question to you is the following. What are the actions and tools that could help to prevent the issue of climate-induced migration in general? Thank you.
So whoever would like to elaborate on that? Ms. Warner, maybe? Ms. Warner, could you answer, please? Oh, you have technical difficulties.
Does this work? Okay. Does it work now? Not yet. Ah, it does work. Now it's green. Here we go. Thanks, Paloma. This is a really critical question. We're all gathered here. There we go. I'll just wait a minute. Ah, here we go. We'll have another solution.
We're waiting for the microphone.
Here we go. Thank you so much. Thanks so much. Paloma, thanks for this critical... Oh, I'm reading the wrong name. I'm sorry. Thank you so much for the important question. We're gathered here at COP27 at the first Conference of the Parties with a full focus on implementation. It's been 30 years of negotiation and coordination. And up until now, countries have been successful to some degree, recognizing that climate change poses a really serious threat to you as youth and to all of nature and humanity, exactly as you said in your opening statement. Now, as we look toward the next years together, we have to implement, and that's the theme of the COP27 presidency. In fact, I think you'll see it throughout Together for Implementation right there. So what can countries do, what can communities do to make sure that all of us, but especially frontline communities, have choices? Most of us want to stay in our homes. Some of you, especially as youth, have grand aspirations. You dream of a better life for yourself, for your communities. Education will take you to new places. You're obviously traveling the world and shaping the world. And that's the kind of mobility that I think everyone wants to foster. But your question raises one that all of us have to grapple with. We want to make sure that all people, and again, especially youth, and especially women and children, everyone together can choose, and that they have options to stay and to build a good life with climate change where they live. So one of the key questions that many negotiators are asking are, what are the actions that need to be taken now to anticipate and prepare for a world that might be at 1.5 degrees in just a few years, definitely in our future and in your future? What do we need to do? And there are many very specific things. I'll name a few, but there will be many more that aren't really widespread yet. And all of you, especially you as youth, will help build a world where these practices are done at a widespread scale. So what are a few of these things that will help avert and minimize people having to leave their homes, let's say displacement? Some of the things have to do with early warning systems. People need to know, is a big storm coming? If early warning systems operate effectively, pastoralists and farmers can go and they can get their assets, their animals out of harm's way. They can harvest their crops. They can make sure that farm implements or crops are stored and safe from the storm. Those are just a couple of examples in really specific contexts. If you live in a city, all of us have been experiencing really extreme heat. Our elderly people especially, but also people who work outside, need to know that heat is coming, and there are things that we can do to make sure that people are safe from the heat. So those are a few things. Going a little bit farther afield, engineers are working together with mayors to make sure that where people live and where people work are safe, so that if some unexpected climate change impact materializes, like Cinziana was telling us about, that at least those impacts can be anticipated and people don't have to flee for their lives. These are just a few of the things that we know today. Now, there are other things that are not yet widespread that would help a lot to do the things that will keep people in place, particularly when it comes to livelihoods. So across the world, there are a few farmers and ranchers who have, and also indigenous people who manage soils and biodiversity. And they're doing practices that actually regenerate nature and regenerate soils. And some of these things are very practical. For example, in the part of the world where I'm from a dryland area. I'm from the United States. And some of the indigenous peoples have very, very generations-long tradition of taking care of the soil and providing food for their people. And they've lived in fairly harsh conditions that most of us wouldn't know how to live in because they know how to steward nature. So what I'm asking all of us to listen to you as youth, to find out what's innovative, also to listen to elders, particularly from indigenous communities, also women indigenous leaders, and hear what are the practices that have worked well in the past. What can we take forward together, maybe at a bigger scale? And that's your job, Minister, to figure out what would work at a country level scale. And what new things do we need to do together to get ready for a world that's a little bit different or a lot different from one which we've anticipated in the past? Most of us want to stay in our communities. Let's make sure that that's possible. And let's make sure that those who need to go or who want to go can do so in a safe and dignified way that allows a peaceful, stable future for everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your answer. That deserves a clap. And now if we can move to Izvi, please. Would you present your statement and a question? Thank you.
Hi. Okay. My name is Izvi. I'm from Brazil. And in Brazil, we have two types of migration. The traditional one, there is the migration that people are moving to northeast, to the southeast because of the drought and in search of job opportunities. And this phenomenon that demands attention in terms of adaptation. People do not find support and public policies to help in this process of migration to another state. And the second one is the erosive process that are happening in the coast of Brazil, as is happening in the municipality of Atafona in São João da Barra, Rio de Janeiro, where I'm from. The beach resort is being swallowed by marine erosive process. And I have a quote from the woman who lived there. The resident of Atafona, she lives there for 20 decades, and she saw the sea slowly approach until it brought down to the wall of her house in March of 29. Determining the fact that her to decide to take action after years of waiting. And quote, she said, last year, the sea reached my street and knocked down my wall. I had to put out seedings because I want to continue living here for a while longer. I'm already demolishing the house and have moved into a little house that I built in the back. This is the way I can stay here on my land for a few more years until the sea occupies everything that I have. So people were losing more their material things. They are losing their hopes, their stories, and we don't have public policies and adaptation. This is very important call to bring climate justice as a tool to find solutions for people who can still adapt and for who loss and damage are already a reality. And it's important to map where these climate migrations are occurring because what is not named, we cannot see. So my question is, we have a growing number of internally displaced people moving to countries, generally from the European countries. And my question is, what are the challenges of European countries related to these issues, and what kind of assistance would they need to cope with this?
So whoever would like to take the floor, you're very welcomed. Your Prime Minister. Prime Minister, would you like to answer? Or maybe if we can repeat the question to make it more clear.
I'm sorry, I think I've been on the spot. I was not expecting the question, but I'll still take it. I think the question is, if I captured it right, there is a growing number of internally displaced people, which puts additional pressure on developing countries.
Exactly.
I think that's the question.
And the question is, or maybe Isvi, can you repeat your question, please?
Related to these issues and what kind of assistance they need?
Yeah, more like it. And what are the challenges that developing countries are facing, and what sort of assistance would they need
exactly
to deal with these challenges? Let me begin by saying that I think we are caught in paralysis of analysis. When a house is on fire, you do not waste time analyzing what started the fire, what instruments you can use to douse the fire, etc., etc. When we were hit by COVID-19, it was taken as a global crisis. We all put our heads together, politicians, technocrats, academicians, we all came together to deal with a global challenge. Now, when you look at the issue of climate change, I think we've gathered enough scientific evidence that highlights the fact that we are in a crisis. And when you look at internally displaced persons vis-a-vis climate change, it's a reality. And if I take my country, for example, you've got people that are displaced from their traditional land, from places where they have lived for generations. You've got floods, you've got drought, a number of catastrophes, cyclones, displacing people in the process. And when you look at the damage that takes place as a result of calamities that are associated with climate change, and then you try to quantify the damage, you put value to it, it is quite disheartening. It's a real challenge that developing countries are facing. And talking about how much support would they need, quite a difficult question for me to put a figure to it or to put a value to it. The fact remains that there is need for support. She mentioned about early warning systems that are needed in order for us to avert such situations. But this is just one way of trying to adapt. The truth is, developing countries are facing real challenges, huge challenges, and as she rightly said, they have contributed the least to climate change, and they are suffering the worst of climate change. So when you talk about how much they should get in terms of assistance, I think all this needs to be put into context to say, yes, we will be talking about, yes, compensating or helping these internally displaced people. But this is just a fraction of the problem. We really need to deal with the problem, and we really need to come together and make sure that these developing countries are helped to deal with a situation to which they've contributed the least. I think that's how I would put it. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister. I would like to give the floor now to Michael, please.
All protocols observed. I want to take my talk right from where my colleague, the Brazilian lady, mentioned, to be able to address that issue and address the challenge why we are here today. In the course of her talk, she mentioned what the woman was able to do to address the challenge she's facing. Even though that the effort she's making is limited, she asked the question, what will the European nations do? The point I want to take from our analysis is this. The youth have a great work to do. My joy is that we are gathered here. We have been attending COP, just like the speaker mentioned, the guest speaker, that the time has come for we to look at what we call the implementation, and that is the theme of this COP27, Together for Implementation. But we have to be careful. As we move towards the stage of implementations, we want to see that there is no fabric is left behind. There are certain indices or certain strategies, certain options that we need to put in place while we are doing our implementation. Perhaps those who sat down to think about the issue of climate change might not have given thought to the issue of the crisis that will lead to migration. And that is why this side event is specifically done to address that segment. When we are mentioning about refugee, we think about people displaced by war. We think about persecution, but we've never given thought to the issue of those who are affected by climate crisis, and that is the point she's trying to raise. This is a time the big nations, the industrial nations, need to pump the necessary finance to mitigate the impact of where these climate crises are taking place, just like in Latin America, in Africa, and some other places. Because it will be very, very hard. You look at the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and you see the volume of refugees. Other European nations, it was easy for them to absorb them. If it has been natural disaster, Are we sure we are going to see that kind of reception? No. And that is the essence of this side event. So that we start looking at how we can refabricate our local and domestic policies and laws to reflect that climate crisis is a big challenge to vulnerable nations and cities. There are floodings, crises, even in Fiji, Philippines, and other Latin and Pacific. There are problems that are happening. So as youth that are gathered here today, this is my message. Just like the Brazilian experience shows that the woman did not wait for the government to take policies when there is no existing policy. We want to work together, come up with a policy framework that we can engage the government with. Climate change is a new field to most of us, but the problem and challenges that come with climate issue is so numerous that if we don't address it as it comes up, the years will come by. We mentioned in the year 2000, this is what we want to do. 2020, now with 2030 agenda, 2065, we keep on pushing the goalpost far away. So what is going to help us as youth and as champion of the climate fiasco? We need to track, now we are in Shamshek, what is the level of implementation of the previous COP? So that in Dubai, in COP28, we will say from 2022 to 2023, this is what we can able to evaluate that the nations has done. So that from there we pick it up. We can't be coming to a COP every year, this is what we are going to do, this is what we are going to do, without being pragmatic and coming up with a concrete solution that is variable that we can be able to evaluate and see. So we have now come at the stage that as young ones, I love the initiations you are doing, I love the thing. We want to put pressure on the government. We want to put pressure on the stakeholders so that whatever they are committed to, ask them. We said we want to move from point A to point 2. Now, this is 2023. This is 2024. Have you been able to achieve that purpose? If you have not been able to achieve that purpose, what are those factors that is affecting us from achieving that? That is the way we'll be able to track this process until we achieve what we want. We don't want to come here and speak and go. So this is a time because any society that does not put premium or value on its youth is not a society. The youth are the future. And that is why I get encouraged by the initiations that all of you have taken by trying to make a petition. Go beyond that petition. Try to find out in this conference, this is what we tell the government. This is what we are submitting. We want to meet again in Dubai in 2023, that after the submission we meet, this is what the world has been able to achieve. By then we will know whether we are making progress or not. Before you know, 2030 will come, 2065 will come, we are still on the same page. And then you will no longer be youth, become an adult, you will now pass the same burden or baton down to the coming generation. This is what we want to avoid. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Michael, for your statement. And I would like to move to Paloma, and then decision makers can react to both of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Paloma Brill. I'm 25 years old, and I'm a researcher in the political economy of climate change. And I'm here with the European Environmental Bureau representing the European youth. They told me to explain a bit of my experience in my country regarding climate migrations, and I was thinking about walking you through some set of news that happened in Spain in the latest months. First of all, June 24th of 2022, more than 400 people tried to enter the Spanish enclave of Melilla from Morocco. Most of them were people from sub-Saharan countries trying to run away from the political and economical situation of their countries, which has been exacerbated by the climate change effects. The police in the Moroccan border started throwing stones. and the Spanish police used smoke canisters against the immigrants. Furthermore, the Spanish police allowed the use of violence by the Moroccan police in the Spanish ground against the immigrants. 23 people died in that incident. June 26 of 2022, 23 graves are dug where the victims of the tragedy are buried. No autopsy or identification was carried out. June 30th of 2022, 14 Senegalese citizens died in a boat after this caught fire in their way from Senegal to the Canary Islands. In all this summer of 2022, approximately 300 people have been disappearing their journey from Senegal to the Canary Islands, and no one knows their situation or if they are still alive. July of 2022, the Spanish government approves an investment of 4 million euros for the reinforcement of the fence in Ceuta. Because yes, we have 2 long fences in our borders in Ceuta and Melilla. I could continue, because we have news like this every month in our country and in the other Mediterranean countries. However, I think you get the idea with this snapshot. I would also like to remark that these migrations are largely caused by the actions of the governments in the global north and these vulnerable countries in the global south. An example of this that I would really like to remark is the fishing agreement between the European Union and Senegal, which has resulted in the overexploitation of the Senegalese waters by the Spanish vessels, generating not only high levels of pollution, but also depleting the resources of the Senegalese fishermen, resources that were already reduced by the climate change effects in the warming waters. This has led to the move and migration of the Senegalese fishermen to places like the Canary Islands in order for the look of resources and a dignified reality. One of these testimonies of this injustice is Amina, a fish processor that is living in St. Louis, that is an inner town in Senegal, who had to move from her coastal town because there was not enough resources there for her to continue working. She was telling us months ago, except today, we have not received any type of fish, any. We are very tired. There are no more fish. We even send our children in boats to Europe. Some of mine went to Spain, and some made it. However, others didn't. I am presenting you with these facts because climate-induced migration is a current crisis that is happening right now, and the countries of the global north, we have to be responsible and prepared to give a proper answer to it. A proper answer that does not include police brutality. A proper answer that does not include investment in measures for reinforcing our fences. And that above all, does not leave them, all these migrants, alone in their journey. And also, once they have entered our countries. And as the facts show, we are far away from being ready. We do not realize how racist, and yes, racist is the word, we are, until we don't see how our responses to migrant crisis are different depending on the country of origin of the people coming. One clear example, and I think that all of us and all of you are aware of it, is the different responses of the European countries regarding the Ukrainian migration crisis caused by the Russian war and the Syrian migration crisis that happened in 2015, also caused by a war. And this climate migration that is happening now, this crisis, will just be a magnifying glass of these already existing inequalities and discrimination. And we should be aware of this. We should tell our governments that this is not fair. The Groundswell report of 2021 by the World Bank reported that by 2050, more than 260 million people will be internally displaced in the world just because the countries in the global north are right now not taking enough measures to prevent it. All these people will leave their homes because they will have become flooded, deserted, or because the land will be totally unfertile and useless. And cross-country migration will skyrocket as well, with flows of millions of people coming from the global south to the global north. The effects of global warming will be either the main cause of relocation of those million people or a multiplier of the already existing struggles in these areas. In the face of these circumstances, it is essential to call for action to our governments in the global north, and here I'm calling especially the European Union, which didn't even dare to come with one of their representatives here today. Firstly, we have to adopt the necessary mitigation measures needed to reach the objective of not surpassing the 1.5 degrees. Because all these people who will be displaced if we don't stop right now, they have the right to stay in their houses. Secondly, to provide the necessary adaptation measures and losses and damages with any type of conditionality or interest. This is the main topic of this COP, and it's not enough repeated until we reach this goal. Because if not, this will end up being an imperialist, profitable business of the North, which keeps giving loans and just exploiting the countries of the global South. And thirdly, the adoption of the necessary infrastructure for integrating the displaced populations, an infrastructure that guarantees their human rights, their welfare and interests, and also, which sometimes we tend to forget, integrates them in the decision-making, in all those posts in the agenda in which they are being affected to. Because we should stop victimizing them and showing them just as passive actors in this game. And we should start listening to all these people who are being displaced and whose voices are asking for a better future. There is no climate justice without human rights. There is no climate justice if our reaction is to push displaced people out of our borders when coming back to their countries is not an option. There is no climate justice without a process of transparency and accountability in the global North governments who constantly try to lie to our face, telling us that they are already doing enough. It's not enough. That's why one of our youth pledges that we want to present, and one of the questions that I also want to present to the policymakers present here and to whoever policymaker might be listening to this, is that displacements might happen rapidly after an environmental disaster, and therefore the preparation for these human movements should be included in an NAPs of each country, where the well-being and safety of migrants would be indicated, NAPs especially of the global North countries. Should climate-induced migrations then be acknowledged as an effective adaptation strategy? And then why? Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Paloma, for your speech and for your brilliant question. I would maybe like to give a floor to our last youth speaker, Solomon, because we are running a little bit back to schedule. So please, Solomon, if you could share your statement, and then we give the floor to decision makers, and then we open the Q&A for the audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and good fellow afternoon to you all. I'm Solomon, and I'm coming all the way from the South Pacific, from Solomon Islands. Today's presentation, I understand we're pressed for time, so I'll just be very quick. First and foremost, I just would like to share a little bit of four facts that we, at least, even though we do not get anything message out of the day, we need to acknowledge this as we leave this a doorway over there. First is that 1.5 degrees that we compromised on back in 2015 does not mean, will not allow Pacific Islanders and many people around the world to thrive. It will only permit us to survive. Clear example would be the fact that if you look at the 1.5 degree report in the IPCC, it acknowledges that at 1.5 degrees, we will lose 70% to 99% of our coral reefs. For us in the Pacific, without our reefs, it is a very hard and difficult for us to survive and thrive in those circumstances. Second is that climate-induced migration, it is loss and damage. It is the acknowledgement that our lands that we used to reside in, we have to let go and have to move. And those lands will no longer be inhabitable by humans. Third is that despite we are advocating for climate-induced migration, we must not reduce or go back or discount our efforts on adaptations. I am from the Solomon Islands and I've grown there all my life. I do not see much development on adaptations. We have a little bit of mitigation projects, we have a little bit of policy, but still we are still lacking adaptation efforts and projects on the ground. I think large part of it comes with a huge price tag that comes with projects relating to adaptation. And finally, we have the misconception that we look at the Pacific Islands, you see we are very small and insignificant in the middle of nowhere in the maps, and they think, oh, these countries will go underwater and they will have to move overseas. That is a misconception, because climate-induced migration for the Pacific will be largely internal before it goes external. In preparation for this, the Pacific is already doing their work. Our governments, our civil society, young people are already working the fields to develop and prepare our people for the worst case scenarios. But also using it as an opportunity to include partnerships from other countries, people, stakeholders throughout the world, to how do we ensure that we move these people inland in the best way possible. In the Pacific, 90% of our population resides in the coastal areas, and some in outer small islets and islets around nearing our countries. The problem being that 90% of the people would then have to move inland, but this comes back to the question that, is this feasible for countries in the Pacific who are already struggling from all the adverse effects of climate change? And the fact that how are we going to move all of these people, it is, to me, is a grave concern, because it is a logistical nightmare. And there's so many failed efforts of past efforts of people relocating, not on climate-induced migration, but already also on other projects that people have to move due to earthquakes and conflict, and even colonial times of migration or movement of people. And this has been proved quite problematic. But with this case scenario of how climate change is going to impact and move people, it is deeply concerning. If you look internally into the Pacific, we do not are free from our own problems. We have issues stemming from the past, in the present, and we will continue to grow in the future. So one problematic one is that the issue of land tenure in the Pacific. How do you move people to land that has already been occupied by people? And large part of the land, especially from when I come from, in the Solomon Islands, 90% of it is owned by customary traditional owners. How are you going to move 90% of people into those traditional lands? How are you going to negotiate that? How are you going to ensure that not only the rights of the people that are going to be moved are protected, but what about the rights of the people who are already ownership of those lands? Regardless of, while we wait for the finance to come, we're coming here, Pacific Islands countries, members, negotiators in the negotiating room, as well as other developing states countries are in the negotiating room trying to convince the developed nations about we need to make commitments on finance, adaptation, loss and damage, the rest. While we're still doing that and demanding the desperately needed climate finance, technology and information transfer and capacity building, people back at home are not waiting for it anymore. They start continuously preparing themselves and starting to move themselves as well. So that has to be acknowledged. But it will be truly messy if we do not intervene and assist them in the movement. We need to understand that there will be a lot of casualties. There's a lot of suffering and sorrow of the people. They'll be grieving, and but the start that we can do is that how can we facilitate them so that we can minimize and mitigate those suffering that people will face. In our draft relocation guidelines that a lot of our members in our organization are working towards, with the support of a government in Solomon Island, strongly emphasize the need of human rights. And this is really particularly important because science brought us to the question of climate change. But it's the people's stories that really touch us our heart to understand that this problem not only undermines the environment and animals and plants and all, it also is a human rights crisis, as my colleague has highlighted today. The climate crisis is a human rights crisis, and this is particularly quite important in the case of climate-induced migration.
Thank you, Solomon. Thank you. Maybe if Ms. Varna could react to it. I saw you that you were nodding a lot, so if you could put briefly your comment to the speeches of the youth. Ms. Varna? Or whoever would like to take the floor, you can react to the speeches.
All right. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, it gives me great pleasure to make these remarks on behalf of Malawi during this auspicious occasion. Let me take this opportunity to thank the Youth and Environment Europe for organizing this meeting. We are faced with multiple challenges which are preventing our countries from attaining their sustainable development goals. Poverty, hunger, conflicts, diseases are some of these challenges. Climate change has also remained a major challenge that continues to disturb our efforts in the implementation of the SDGs. Nowadays, more often than ever, we hear about record-breaking storms, flooding, heat waves, hurricanes, sea level rise, droughts, and wildfires. When such disasters strike, they bring in numerous challenges which affect people and communities. The first direct impact of such disasters on human development is obviously detrimental, causing at its worst deaths, injuries, and disabilities, but also the destruction and damage to housing, basic infrastructure, productive capital, physical assets in general, and disrupting market claims, not forgetting internal displacement. Disasters cause people to move from their homes to safe places, either temporarily or permanently. They affect countries and people differently. Countries which are vulnerable, particularly in the least developed group, which includes Malawi, are disproportionately affected due to their weak systems and infrastructures. Generally, children and the youth living in these countries face even bigger risks due to poverty and other vulnerable situations. Malawi is a least developed country and is also a landlocked country. This means that we are faced with multiple economic and financial challenges which are exacerbated by disasters, including those caused by climate change. It is also a disaster-prone country with common hazards such as floods, heavy rains, strong winds, earthquakes, pests, and disease outbreaks, just to mention but a few. Allow me to highlight some of the climate change-related disasters which happened in Malawi for the past few years, resulting in loss of lives, damage to property, as well as displacement of people. In early March 2019, Malawi was hit by Cyclone Idai. Heavy and persistent rains led to severe flooding across some districts in southern Malawi. More than 868,900 people were affected, including more than 86,980 displaced, with at least 60 deaths and 672 injuries recorded according to the government. In total, 15 districts and 2 cities were impacted. In January 2022, Tropical Storm Anna struck Malawi, Madagascar, and Mozambique with high winds and torrential rains, leaving at least 80 people dead across borders. During this disaster, 22,364 households, 109,359 people moved from their homes and were hosted in camps, churches, schools, and other public infrastructure. As a country, we are working hard to address climate change challenges by putting in place deliberate policies which will ensure that climate risks are reduced. We are aware that when disasters strike, young generations take decisions to move out of Malawi to find solutions to the economic problems caused by climate impacts. In this regard, we are engaging the youths in our efforts to defeat climate change crisis. However, let me mention that we have a huge gap in financing, technology, and capacity building which affect our efforts in addressing climate challenges. Such gaps need attention from the international community. I believe COP27 will come up with concrete solutions which will address these gaps. Climate change is indeed a huge and complicated threat to the whole world. Each one of us needs to take part to deal with this threat. A standalone approach will not yield positive results. Let me commend the Secretary General for taking the leading role in involving the youth in the fight against climate change. The youths are innovative and energetic. Member states are all relevant stakeholders and must include the youth when addressing climate challenges. In conclusion, since climate change knows no borders, we also need to consider regional approaches when addressing this challenge. Regional youth groups need to work together and find concrete solutions to this challenge. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I would like to give the floor now to Ms. Kokovarna because I know that you have to leave soon. So if you would like to share with us our very last remarks, and then I would give the floor to my colleagues at EEB. Thank you.
Just a little more quick. Thank you so much. Ministers are problem solvers. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much to the organizers of this important intergenerational dialogue here at COP27. Fanny, Michael, Paloma, Isfi, Solomon, and Narana. It's been humbling and important to listen to your thoughts. And I wish you very well in your work, trying to get leaders to hear your perspectives as the up-and-coming generation and address your need for a bright and good future. And we'll do everything that we can to be part of that and to support you. Just a few reflections on your comments here and also to the minister. When we think about people on the move, we often think about the 20th century. We look back. The 20th century was marked by a lot of progress and technology. We certainly have, or at least our parents, had the chance of living much longer than the parents before them. The 20th century was also a time of massive upheaval, as well as destruction, and many of our institutions that address human mobility today were established in the last century to deal with the problems of that century. And here we are well into the 21st century, talking about your future and talking about climate change. And it seems that what we need is a shift in mindset, a mindset that helps us look forward and ask, how do we redefine how we work together? And that's very hard. It means that we need to build some new things together. We also need to build on the shoulders of people who have come before. And so I take that, and it's humbling to listen to your thoughts and recognize that we have to do that literally together. There are three things that we can build on. And you're aware of those. I'll mention these. They'll sound very process-oriented because we are in a formal decision-making space. But these are things that you here as youth and as delegates and ministers can work on together. In 2018, underneath the UNFCCC process, a set of groundbreaking recommendations were made by the task force on displacement, and many of you know these recommendations. I would encourage you who aren't yet familiar to read those recommendations. They have to do with helping countries go back home and create legislation, policies, and practices that help people avert and minimize displacement related to climate change impacts. There are invitations for United Nations organizations, and Cinziana mentioned some of those things that are now moving forward almost 4 or 5 years after. Also, the Global Compact on Migration, also in 2018, was established and called for safe, regular, dignified pathways for migration. And that Global Compact, thinking of what you are calling for, Fanny, and many of you, really called for safe ways for people to move if they need to move. And obviously, big investments and partnerships that ensure that youth all over the world have good livelihoods and a chance at an education, an opportunity. And sometimes that does involve movement. And for even more of us, that involves staying in our communities and building there. We need to make sure that those opportunities stay on the table. So for all of us here at COP27, maybe a call for action. Please talk with delegates. If you look, they have pink badges. This is a blue badge. Look for the band right here that's pink. So I see some of you in the room are representatives in countries. Take your thoughts and talk with those people who are here negotiating. Also listen. They face many challenges, and this will take working together. So please do that. Please ask for specific things, as well as listen to what you can do to go back home and help them carry out this important work to implement the Paris Agreement. I wish us all a lot of luck. It's a hard go that we have ahead of us, but there's very much hope to be had in spite of the challenges together. And last but not least, we're listening, and let's continue this conversation. This is one COP, and there are many, many more to come. And Michael, just what you said, we have many goalposts ahead of us and many milestones to pass together. So we'll listen, and hopefully we'll pass those hand in hand together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What a great way to finish our panel. And if you have any question from the audience, we will very be happy to welcome at our reception, which will take place here. And now, last but not least, I would like to give the floor to my colleagues at European Environmental Bureau to hand over their petition. So the stage is yours.